what's happening in Syria?
The fall of Assad's regime in Syria has been faster than anyone imagined.
Syria is going through, I think, a major transformation. People are both excited and scared, I think unsure. I think it's a moment of massive transformation, but one that's a story that we don't have the final, epilogue for. So my name is Lama Mourad, an assistant professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. I focus primarily on migration, refugee politics, both at the level of global governance, so international institutions, the UN, but primarily my research area and my field site is the Middle East. So I work on Syrian refugee issues in the Middle East, but also broader refugee politics in the region. So I think it's important to sort of bring us back to really 2011, 2012, when really all across the Arab world, we had a large-scale uprisings of civilian-led movements that were demanding change from their governments. And in many cases, these were authoritarian, very repressive governments. In that moment, primarily in 2012, Arabs, both in the Arab world and outside the Arab world were struck by the intensity and the profound changes that were happening in their region. So we were seeing regimes that, had been in power for decades crumble at popular protests. And Syria's story is part of that story. So what we saw is first the fall of Ben Ali in Tunisia, then Mubarak in Egypt, and quickly thereafter protests began in Syria.
The deaths continue in the crackdown on protesters in Syria, with another 25 people killed on Thursday, according to activists.
What began as a popular uprising in Syria was quickly and very harshly repressed by the Syrian regime, the Assad regime at the time. And what began as a popular uprising was transformed over the years into a civil war. So what we had is a moment of massive demand for change, exuberance on the part of civilians, quashed by massive repression and the sort of geopolitical overwhelm. And then a prolonged period of a status quo that became almost just the norm for everybody. What does it mean for Syria? I think that really depends on who you ask and also your time horizon, right? So right now we're still talking, we're a month out of the fall of the Assad regime. In many ways, there are lots of reasons to be optimistic for Syria's future. One, the massive, whether we want to call it a political coup or popular uprising led by non-state armed groups, happened with very little, relatively speaking, very little blood being shed, which is quite exceptional, and I think is really important for the next phase and for the future of Syria, because at least in the immediate sense, there seemed to be broad-based civilian, at least acceptance for this change, right? There wasn't a great deal of resistance, whether from the civilian forces themselves, and civilians themselves kind of accepted the new authority, but also even from the Syrian army. So former, one of the images that I think we were seeing really, that was quite something in the days leading up to December 8th was the number of Syrian army outposts that were just being abandoned by the Syrian army itself. So there are lots of signs to be hopeful about what's coming next, but there are also a lot of open questions. Of course, everybody knows that this is, HTS is a group that used to be part of Al-Qaeda. It was a group that has an Islamist ideology. It's a group that has also committed really concerning, crimes, and has many opponents even in where it, governs in Idlib. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of indication that they intend on taking very seriously the presence of minorities in Syria, respecting human rights. They seem to be very committed and focused on economic change as the bedrock of popular support, and I think they're probably right in assessing that. But there are many, many obstacles along the path, right? Even if their intentions are good. I take my cue also from Syrians. They see this as the only path forward, because with Assad, they knew, what else was coming, which was just more repression, greater economic decimation, profound corruption. A family that has enriched itself on the backs of its people. At least now, many Syrians will say, at least we have hope and we can imagine what can be. And Syrians are not staying quiet. Protests on several different issues are happening actively in Syria, and the new regime is responsive, or at least appears to be responsive to those demands, right? It seems to be aware that it needs to have popular buy-in. As they say, as of recording, a number of European countries have at least paused their asylum processing for Syrians, and many of these happened really in the days that followed the Assad regime. They didn't waste any time really in terms of pausing. And at least in some of these cases, like in Austria's case, for example, there's clear indications that this is coming along with potentially plans for large-scale deportations of Syrians that are already in the country. In other cases, there has been sort of this separation between the pausing of the asylum processing from any questions around deportation or revocation of status. So they're slightly different things, right? So one is about new asylum claims or claims that are in the system, and the other is about whether and how what happened in Syria changes what happens to Syrian refugees that are already settled or that have accepted status in the country, right? In the region where the majority of Syrian refugees are still today, we really have a few key host countries, right? So Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey are the primary ones, and to a lesser extent also Iraq. And the situation there is even more complicated. In many ways, in a general sense, the situation of Syrian refugees in the region is even harder, at least from a legal standpoint. In some ways, of course, these are places where Syrians are culturally often have a history of migration. So, for example, in Lebanon, even prior to the arrival of Syrian refugees, there were somewhere between 500 to 700,000 Syrian labor migrants in the country, right? So there are pre-existing ties between, Lebanon and Syria and Syrians and Lebanese that on a day-to-day level make it maybe the life of Syrians smoother. But from a legal standpoint and from a government standpoint, their lives are incredibly restricted. They have restrictions on the kind of work that they can do. Their legal status is very precarious, and they're really at the mercy and at the whim of both local governments that know that they are very weak in their power, but also if the political situation in the country changes and there's a pressure for them to return to their countries. My view is that we should keep our eyes on Syria very closely, and we should definitely ensure that this new government makes the changes that it commits to, but that we would be mistaken to rush to an electoral system before there's been time even for civil society and other political groups in the country to start to organize, to have a basis for themselves. If you were to actually have an election tomorrow in Syria, I actually think that there's a very, very good chance that the current ruling government would probably be one of the few political actors that would be able to succeed in the election, right? So I actually think a little bit of time might actually be good for political pluralism in Syria, because we're talking about a country that's been infrastructurally decimated, where some of its most important political leadership has either been exiled or disappeared in its notorious prisons. And so all of this takes time, right, to rebuild that political vibrancy. And I'm very optimistic when I see this kind of intensity with which Syrians are investing in this political future and are, rushing to reactivate and re-engage networks that they've built over the 15 years. But at the same time, I think we need to be mindful that trying to push too much change too quickly can be very destabilizing. And one of the things I really want to leave us with, I think, for both thinking about the decision-making of Syrian refugees, but also around Syria more broadly and the decision-making of all political actors, is that we're in a moment of deep, deep uncertainty, but it's also a moment, as I said earlier, of profound hope. And what it's shown to Syrians is that nothing is forever, right? And that even if this particular political group that is currently in power doesn't satisfy the ambitions of Syrians today and into the future, that they have the ability, that Syrians themselves have the ability to make that change.